In a forgotten New England town, a family lives with a secret older than America itself. The power to see the future, and the curse of never being able to change it. For 7 generations, the Caldwells have watched death, disaster, and despair arrive exactly as foretold, until one boy dares to ask, what if fate isn't fixed, just misunderstood? In the waning days of the 19th century, as America stood poised between candlelight and electricity, there existed a coastal town untouched by the speed of modernity, a place called Blackmere. Wedged between salt-bitten cliffs and dense pine forests, the town leaned into the Atlantic wind, like an old mariner, battered yet enduring. It was a place of rituals and rhythms, where every face was familiar and every secret had roots deeper than the soil. Atop Harbor View Hill stood the Caldwell residence, a grand Victorian house that loomed over Blackmere like a watchful guardian. It was a house of gables and ironwork, with a widow's walk that stared endlessly out to sea. Inside, generations of Caldwells had lived, prospered, and endured the burden passed down to their bloodline, a gift cloaked as a curse, or perhaps the other way around, the ability to witness future events, but never to alter them. It was September 12, 1899, when the autumn chill first threaded its fingers through Blackmere's narrow streets, sending fog curling around gas lamps and shuttered windows. Inside the Caldwell dining room, the family gathered for supper. The long mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, was set with china edged in gold. Silver candlesticks cast flickering shadows on the walls, dancing like specters of past meals. Elias Caldwell sat at the head, a tall man with graying temples and the steady hands of a shipyard owner. Beside him, Margaret, graceful and composed, poured tea into delicate cups with the elegance of a woman born into gentility. Their children filled the rest of the table. Thomas, 19, recently returned from Harvard. Elizabeth, 17, radiant and sharp-witted. And William, the youngest, a boy of 10 with storm-gray eyes and an unsettling stillness about him. Completing the family was Margaret's mother, Agatha Winters, a woman of 72 winters herself, who bore her age like iron under lace. That evening, the conversation floated easily. Thomas recounted the philosophies debated in Cambridge halls. Elizabeth gushed about the upcoming harvest festival and her plans to decorate the town square. William spoke of collecting sea glass along the rocky shore. Then it happened. With a sharp, shattering crack, Agatha's teacup fell to the floor. Porcelain shards scattered across the carpet, tea soaking into fibers like spilled blood. The room froze. Agatha's eyes, usually sharp and pale, had turned fully white, blank as marble. Her spine stiffened, hands gripping the table until her knuckles went bloodless. "The Lambert boy," she whispered, but her voice was no longer hers. It echoed low and strange, as if coming from beneath the floorboards. Tomorrow, midday, the quarry, loose stone. His mother's cries will echo for days. Then silence. Agatha blinked once, twice. The color bled back into her irises. She glanced at the broken cup with a puzzled frown. "Oh, dear," she murmured, dabbing at her lap with a napkin. "I've made a mess again." Elias and Margaret exchanged a look, not of panic, but of resignation. This was not the first time, nor would it be the last. Thomas cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Elizabeth reached out to steady Agatha's trembling hand. Only William continued eating, unbothered, methodically spearing potatoes as if prophecy were as routine as dessert. Elias leaned close to his wife. "I'll speak with Henry Lambert in the morning," he said quietly, "though I suspect it will do little good." Margaret nodded, her expression grave. "We must try nonetheless." For nearly 2 centuries, the Caldwells had borne this strange inheritance. In each generation, at least one family member would gain the sight, involuntary glimpses into the days ahead, sudden and inescapable, sometimes mundane, sometimes catastrophic, never preventable. Agatha had inherited the ability from her father, who had died raving about a train derailment 3 days before it happened. Young William had only recently begun showing signs, his dreams oddly specific, his offhand remarks eerily accurate. Yet the cruelest truth was this: no Caldwell had ever succeeded in changing what they foresaw. Fate, it seemed, was deaf to warning, and vision, far from power, was merely a lens to witness suffering before it arrived. That night, as the wind howled through the pines and the sea clawed at the cliffs below, the family retired with heavy hearts. Upstairs, William paused at the top of the stairs, looking back down into the dimly lit dining room. Something in him understood, even then, that this curse was not a storm passing overhead. It was a tide, slow, inescapable, and rising. The morning broke gray and hushed, as if the sky itself were reluctant to bear witness to the day. Fog clung to the cobblestone streets of Blackmere, thick as wool, muffling footsteps and muting voices. The sea beyond the cliffs crashed with rhythmic indifference, cold, eternal. Elias Caldwell dressed carefully in his study, pulling on a dark suit and adjusting the chain of his gold pocket watch. The timepiece had belonged to his grandfather, the first Caldwell in their ledger to write of visions unheeded and warnings unreceived. Elias tucked it into his vest, not out of sentiment, but necessity. It had once marked hours with confidence. Now, it ticked like a countdown. The Lambert residence sat at the edge of town near the quarry. Henry Lambert, a broad-shouldered man with soot-roughened hands and eyes narrowed by years of squinting against rock dust, met Elias at the door. His expression was guarded, skeptical. "I'm not here as a businessman," Elias began, removing his hat. "I come as a father, a neighbor." Henry crossed his arms. "Then speak plain." Elias inhaled deeply. "Keep your son from the quarry today. Just this once." A beat passed. The wind rustled the dead leaves between them. Henry snorted. "Because your mother-in-law saw something again?" Elias nodded once. "She did, and I believe her. I can't afford to lose a day's wages, Caldwell. Neither can Timothy. He's worked beside me since he was 12. Knows the quarry like the back of his hand." "I understand," Elias replied, steady. "That's why I brought this." He reached into his coat and pulled out the gold watch, the family heirloom. "This is worth more than a day's wages. I'll trade it, no questions asked. It buys Timothy a day off." Henry's face hardened. "I'm not some beggar, and I don't take handout from the man who owns half this town." Elias sighed. "Then take it as a favor, for your son." But the door was already closing. Elias stood for a moment on the frostbitten step, the useless watch heavy in his palm. He tucked away, turned, and walked back toward Harborview Hill. One footstep after another, each one echoing like a metronome counting toward disaster. At precisely 12 minutes past noon, the stone broke loose. It wasn't a storm or a blast. No omens or shouts. Just a shudder of earth, a snap like thunder, then silence. 16-year-old Timothy Lambert was beneath the quarry wall when it fell. A half-ton slab of granite crushed him before he could scream. Death was instant, but his mother's cries, sharp and feral, rang out through the valley and echoed exactly as Agatha had whispered. The funeral followed 2 days later. Closed casket. The quarry closed for a week out of respect. But respect was hollow and wrapped in grief. From their place at the back of the service, the Caldwell family watched in silence. Elias held Margaret's hand, and her knuckles were bloodless. Thomas stood rigid, his face pale. Elizabeth dabbed at her eyes. William simply stared, wide-eyed, unreadable. That night, the house on Harborview Hill felt colder than the sea wind outside. Dinner was subdued, the clink of silverware loud in the absence of conversation. Finally, Thomas set his fork down, eyes distant. "Maybe we're not supposed to change the future," he said quietly. "Maybe we're just meant to witness it." Elizabeth flinched. "What's the point of that? To suffer twice, once in sight and again in experience." Elias ran a hand down his beard. "Your great-grandfather tried. Dozens of times. Once, he foresaw a fire that would engulf half of Boston. He sent letters, telegrams, warnings to anyone who would listen. When the fire came, it burned just as he saw. The only difference was that he was mocked, called a lunatic, a fraud." Margaret added softly, "The burden of foreknowledge without the power to intervene, that is our family's cross." They fell into silence again until William, who had been absently tracing shapes in his gravy with a spoon, spoke up. "I had a dream last night," he said. Every eye turned to him. He didn't flinch. There was a man, He had a machine. It flew like a bird, but made of metal. He crashed into a bell tower. On Christmas Eve. Margaret's breath caught. Are you sure? Elias asked, voice low. William nodded. I heard the bell. It rang wrong. Cracked. Thomas leaned forward. A flying machine? You mean like the stories from Mr. Wells? No, William said. It was real. I saw the snow, the trees. It's not the church in town. It's the old one in the woods. The table went still. They had all dismissed William's earlier visions as childish fancies. Hints of the gift, perhaps, but nothing consequential. This was different, precise, unnerving. The family ledger, its leather worn smooth by generations of ink and futility, was retrieved. William's vision was carefully documented, date, time, details. As with all entries, a final column remained blank. Attempted intervention, a space waiting to be filled, or ignored, because the Caldwell family had learned, again and again, that the future did not care for warnings. It simply arrived, cruel, indifferent, and always on time. The sky over Blackmere remained low and gray in the days that followed, as if the heavens themselves bore the same weight the Caldwells carried in silence. The town went on. Fishermen returned with heavy nets. Church bells called it devout, and the gossip of Mrs. Calloway's mercantile kept the rhythm of local life steady. But within the Caldwell home, something had shifted. William began to change. It wasn't sudden. There were no grand pronouncements or fits of weeping. But Margaret noticed it first, her youngest waking from sleep already breathless. The sheets tangled around him, his eyes wide and wet with sweat. He wouldn't cry, wouldn't even speak at first. He would only sit still, staring through the window at the forest beyond, as though trying to remember something from the shadows between the trees. During the day, he was quiet, observant. He no longer asked the endless questions that had once filled their halls. Instead, he listened closely when the mail arrived, when Elias spoke with his shipwrights, when Elizabeth read aloud from her penny novels by the parlor fire. William absorbed everything, eyes sharp as glass, watching, cataloging, learning. It was Elias who discovered the boy in the library one evening. The family ledger opened across his lap, lamplight casting William's reflection in the darkened window beside him. You're not meant to read that without permission, Elias said, not unkindly. I wanted to see how far it goes back, William replied without looking up. There's an entry from 1793. A boy saw his brother drown. He tried to keep him from the river for 3 days. Then they both went, and only one came back. Elias's jaw clenched. That was Nathaniel Caldwell. He was 10, just like you. William finally looked up. Did it skip anyone? The sight. Sometimes, Elias admitted, not everyone in every generation. Some never have a vision at all. Why not? William asked. No one knows. The boy nodded, absorbing the answer like a stone dropped into a deep well. That night, the family sat together in the parlor, the fire burning low. Elizabeth was stitching by candlelight. Thomas home for the weekend from Cambridge, his books open on the floor beside him. Margaret played soft notes on the parlor piano. Agatha rocked in her chair, silent, her eyes half-lidded but alert. William broke the calm. I saw another one. The room stilled. It happened in the dream again. But it wasn't a dream. Not really. Margaret stood quickly, as if to hush him, but Elias raised a hand. Let him speak. William's voice was small, but steady. There were 2 boys. Twins. I think they're the Harrington boys, Robert and Richard. They're in a field, the one behind Widow's Hill. There's a well, an old one with rotted boards. They're playing some kind of game. He paused, his lips trembling slightly. One of them falls through. Then the other tries to help and falls too. They don't scream. It's too fast. But I can hear the splash, and I feel the cold. The silence that followed was crushing. When Elias asked, Halloween night. That's over a week away, Thomas said, glancing at the calendar on the mantel. We'll speak to their parents, Margaret said quickly. They won't listen, William murmured, just like the Lamberts didn't. Agatha's rocking stopped. They might if we try a different way, Thomas offered. Something subtle, a town notice, a safety inspection of the old fields. Elizabeth looked up from her embroidery. The twins are always sneaking off. If they're told not to go somewhere, they'll be drawn to it. Elias rubbed his temples. Margaret knelt before William. Are you certain, darling, about what you saw? William hesitated, then nodded. It wasn't like the other dreams. It felt like I was there, watching, and I couldn't move. Later that night, when William had gone to bed and the fire had gone to coals, Agatha stood from her chair, joints cracking like tree branches in frost. The boy sees truly, she said to Elias. He's marked, just like my father before me. It's beginning. Elias didn't reply. His gaze had drifted to the ledger, its latest page still open, still wet with ink. He wondered how many more entries would follow, how many names would be etched into that leather-bound tombstone before someone, someday, found a way to write a different ending. Upstairs, William lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The ticking of the hallway clock was distant, but steady, like footsteps, like a countdown. He didn't fear the visions. He feared what would happen when they stopped surprising him. October arrived with brittle wind and skies the color of tarnished pewter. The trees that ring Blackmere surrendered their leaves to the season, amber, crimson, and brown littering the cobbled streets like embers of a dying fire. But inside the Caldwell house, the cold was not seasonal. It came from within, creeping into corners like an old grief. William's visions intensified. At first, they came only in dreams. Then, they began to bloom in the midst of his waking hours, flashes of places he wasn't, moments he hadn't lived. The images struck without warning. The flick of a carriage wheel shattering on a stone, a kitchen fire at the Blackmere Hotel, a storm swallowing the Merry Widow, a fishing vessel with 4 men aboard. Each vision was recorded, and each vision came true. The family responded the only way they knew how, subtly, carefully, with the practiced caution of people who had spent their entire lives living beside inevitability. Elias tried to persuade the captain of the Merry Widow to postpone his departure, citing the weather. Margaret visited the hotel with an excuse about their winter menu, urging them to check their kitchen flue. Elizabeth left in signed notes, warnings tucked beneath doors or slipped between the pages of books in the church library. But their efforts were stones thrown into a river, each one vanishing without so much as a ripple. The Merry Widow capsized on October 17th. 4 men were lost. The hotel's fire burned the cook and 2 maids. A child was nearly killed when a carriage lost control and crashed into a storefront, just as William had seen, just as the ledger now recorded. After each incident, William withdrew further. He stopped attending school. He stopped going to the market with Margaret. He ate less, slept less, spoke less. What was there to say when the future marched on, deaf to every cry? One night, Margaret found him alone in the library again. The family ledger lay open in his lap, pages fluttering slightly from the draft beneath the old window pane. He looked up at her with eyes that no longer belonged to a child. Great-great-grandfather once tried to save a man from being trampled, he said, his voice hollow. He grabbed him by the coat, pulled him back from the street, but the man struggled. He broke free, stepped into the road just as the horses came. Margaret sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the ledger. You shouldn't read these things, William. Not yet. I have to, he insisted. I'm trying to find the pattern. There is no pattern, Margaret said, softer than she intended. Only pages filled with heartbreak. There must be rules, William whispered. We just don't understand them yet. Maybe we've been trying to stop the wrong things, or looking in the wrong places. Maybe we're part of it. Maybe we're supposed to fail. Margaret looked at her son, her baby, and saw in him the weight of generations. A boy with hands too small for the burden he carried. She'd hoped, prayed even, that the gift would pass him by. But now, seeing him there in the firelight, a shadow across his young face and a ledger resting like a stone in his lap, she knew the truth. The sight had not simply come to William. It had claimed him. I saw something else, he said suddenly, his voice strange and distant. "Just now." Margaret froze. She didn't have to ask. She'd seen the way it happened. The stillness, the fixed gaze, the strange tone, as if another voice whispered through him. "The Harrington twins," William said. "Halloween, the well behind Widow's Field. They'll fall, both of them. The search will last 3 days." He blinked rapidly, and the moment passed. Confusion fluttered across his face. "Did I?" Margaret nodded, wrapping her arms around him. "Yes, love, you did." Later that night, the family convened in Elias's study, the same room where generation after generation had gathered to debate whether knowing the future offered any mercy. "He's too young for this," Margaret said, tears catching in her throat. "He reads a ledger like scripture. He wakes with visions. He's unraveling. He's stronger than you think," Agatha said from her seat near the fire, her knitting still in her lap. "He shouldn't have to be," Margaret shot back. Thomas leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Maybe the issue isn't the visions. Maybe it's what we do with them. We've tried warnings. We've tried bribes, interventions. Nothing works. But what if we change our focus?" "To what?" Elias asked. "Understanding," Thomas said. "Preparation, not prevention. Perhaps we misread the purpose of the site all along." Elias tapped his pipe against the ashtray, the embers falling like dying stars. "Maybe, but first we deal with the twins." The conversation turned to strategy, layers of misdirection and social maneuvering, but William's words lingered over them like a fog. The ledger had been opened. A new entry was inked. Another page, another fate sealed, and William, barely 10, bore the weight of centuries, a boy staring through time, hoping against hope that somewhere in all those lines and ink blots there might be room enough to change something. The approach of Halloween stirred Blackmere into its usual late autumn excitement. Corn stalks and carved pumpkins lined the storefronts. Ribbons of orange and black fluttered from lamp posts. Children rehearsed mischief in whispers and laughter. But in the Caldwell house, celebration was an afterthought. Dread coiled in the shadows, thick as smoke. The family had learned to treat visions like prophecies, yet they still planned as if hope could bend fate's spine. And so they constructed their latest offense with care, precision, and subtlety. It began with Elias visiting Mayor Harrington under the guise of civic concern. They met in the man's study, lined with ship logs, election posters, and portraits of solemn men with bushy mustaches. That old well in Widow's Field, Elias began, swirling a glass of sherry. "There's been talk of mischief out there, boys daring each other, nighttime visits. Someone will get hurt." The mayor frowned. "That land's been abandoned for years." Precisely why it attracted attention. "I'd hate for an accident to sour the town's spirits before election week." Mayor Harrington, distracted by re-election and keen not to appear indifferent to public safety, nodded. "I'll see that it's fenced off before the weekend." But he didn't. Margaret, playing the social card, invited Mrs. Harrington to tea. Over scones and lemon curd, she delicately wove concern into conversation. "With all the older boys causing mischief," she said sweetly, "I do worry about Robert and Richard being out after dark. Perhaps keep them in this year, just until the rowdies settle." Mrs. Harrington smiled, politely dismissing the suggestion. "They're nearly 11. Their father says they're old enough to enjoy Halloween with friends. He's arranged a chaperone." Margaret stirred her tea, hiding the tremble in her hand. Meanwhile, Thomas made a more personal approach. He struck up conversation with Clara Harrington, the twins' older sister, outside the post office. A casual flirtation disguised as concern. "I hear the boys are headed to Widow's Field on All Hallows Eve," he said with a practiced smile. "Not the safest place after dark." Clara rolled her eyes. "They'll be fine. It's just children playing. Besides, my father insists they need to toughen up." She turned to leave before Thomas could respond. He watched her walk away, frustration biting at his chest. Every strategy failed. And then came the night. October 31st arrived with a harvest moon hanging low and golden above the sea. The town stirred with costumed revelry. Children in makeshift ghosts and scarecrows dashed through the streets. Jack-o'-lanterns flickered on porches. Laughter and the sharp smell of cider filled the air. But in the Caldwell house, the mood was brittle and watchful. William sat at his window, his pumpkin untouched on the floor beside him. He stared into the night with solemnity too heavy for a boy his age. Margaret sat near the fire, pretending to read. Agatha dozed upright in her chair. The others hovered in restless silence. Then the clock struck 8. "They're at the well," William whispered. "I can feel it." Margaret stood, reaching instinctively for her coat. "Your father's already gone. He left with lanterns and rope, just in case." But they both knew the truth. Elias was not racing against time. He was racing with it, alongside it, like a shadow trying to outrun dusk. In the clearing behind Widow's Field, beneath brittle trees and the breath of cold wind, the old well waited, its rotted boards hidden beneath dead leaves, its stone mouth gaping like the fossilized jaw of some buried beast. The twins, dressed as highwaymen, were playing a dare, hopping over the well's cover while their friends hooped and cheered. They laughed, they shouted, then they didn't. The wood gave way. First one, then the other. The sound of the fall was muted, wet, final. By the time Elias reached the field, only frightened children remained. One was crying, another whispered. They didn't scream. The town searched for 3 days. Volunteers combed the woods. Ropes were lowered. Voices shouted down the well's black throat. It took all that time to retrieve the bodies, cold and tangled beneath the water, just as William had said. At the funeral, the Caldwells stood again at the back of the church, silent, watchful. The bells tolled, but the sound felt thin, insufficient. William clutched a handkerchief but did not cry. Afterwards, as the townsfolk wept and murmured, the Caldwell family returned home. The ledger waited on Elias's desk. He opened it slowly. The entry had already been written. William had copied it out the night before Halloween. Meticulous, as always. Robert and Richard Harrington. October 31st, Widow's Field. The well. Beside it, in the final column, all interventions failed. Outcome fulfilled. Search lasted 3 days. Elias closed the book. No discussion followed that night. No debate about fate or agency. The family simply went to bed. And William lay in the dark, eyes wide, feeling the ledger's weight even from rooms away. He imagined it pressing down on the house, stone upon stone, until it buried them all beneath its truth. The future could be seen, but it could never be saved. November arrived cloaked in gray, and with it came the hush of winter's slow approach. The sun, when it appeared, clung low to the horizon, casting long shadows to the Caldwell estate like fingers reaching in from another world. Blackmere turned inward. Fires were lit, food preserved, and stories told near hearths to keep the cold at bay. But inside the Caldwell house, warmth was fleeting. William rarely spoke now unless spoken to. He wandered the halls like a boy in a dream, the walls of the house no longer shelter but corridor. The other children in town asked after him less and less. A boy who sees death before it comes is no playmate. He had become the quiet center of a house forever leaning toward disaster. Elias buried himself in the shipyard. Thomas returned to Harvard, his letters increasingly academic and brief. Elizabeth, always sensitive to the air around her, took to embroidery and solitary walks, disappearing for hours at a time. Margaret kept busy with charity, but her mind was never far from the boy she could no longer reach. Only Agatha kept close to William. She saw herself in him, not just in gift but in burden, and in silence. She began to guide him. On a cold afternoon, they sat by the fire in the library. William stared into the flames as Agatha's knitting needles clicked gently beside him. The ledger sat unopened on the desk behind them, its very presence a weight in the room. "I was younger than you," Agatha said at last, "when I first saw something I couldn't stop." William didn't look at her, but his body tensed, listening. "It was my friend Sophia," Agatha continued, her voice rough with age. "She loved to skate. The pond behind her house froze every year, and I saw her falling through the ice. I tried everything. I begged her to stay away. I faked an illness so she'd stay with me instead. I even broke her skates." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. But on that day, it wasn't her skating. It was her brother who fell, and Sophia went in after him. William finally turned to her. "Did you try again? After that?" Agatha nodded slowly. "We always try. That's the tragedy of it. The gift shows you what will be, not what might be. And yet we try. Why do we see it then?" William asked, his voice cracking under the weight of his own question. "If we can't change, why do we have to watch?" Agatha's gaze drifted toward the window, where frost crept along the edges of the glass like delicate veins. "Time," she said softly, "is a river. We can see downstream, glimpses of what's coming. But we can't swim faster than the current. We can't build dams. The river flows as it always has. But rivers can be redirected," William whispered. "They can be dammed, changed." Agatha gave him a sad smile. "Perhaps. But if so, no Caldwell has yet discovered how." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the pressure of unspoken things. Lives lost, futures foreseen, and the creeping suspicion that knowledge without agency is not wisdom, but torment. That night, Margaret found her son asleep in the library, curled beneath a blanket, the ledger open beneath his hand. She moved to close it to shield him, but stopped when she saw the most recent page. Black Mirror Hotel, kitchen fire, minor burns, 3 injured, warning unheeded. Carriage accident, Boston Road. Driver loses arm, advice ignored. Fishing vessel Mary Widow, lost with 4, intervention failed. She turned the page and saw the next entry, not yet dated, but already half-filled. A man, a machine, flying, crashing into a bell tower. Christmas Eve. She traced the words with her finger. The ink was dry, the future already spoken. In the days that followed, William's visions came less frequently, but each time they returned, he was left drained, hollowed out. Margaret tried to comfort him, but he flinched from touch, not out of defiance, but detachment. He was slipping into something else, something the family couldn't reach. One morning, Margaret found him standing barefoot in the frost-dusted grass behind the house, staring out toward the forest. "Are you cold?" she asked, wrapping her shawl around his shoulders. "No," he said. "What are you looking at?" "The trees. That's where the old mission is, isn't it? The church." Margaret followed his gaze. "Yes, 3 miles in." He nodded. "That's where the man crashes. Not the church in town. The old one." She stared at him. "You're sure?" He looked up at her, eyes unblinking. "I heard the bell again last night, but it rang wrong. Broken. I think that's why he crashes." The wind carried the sound of distant waves, and for a moment, the world felt paused, suspended between the knowing and the doing. And Margaret understood, with a mother's instinct, that the ledger was far from full. That Christmas would come, and with it, another page, one more line written in ink they couldn't erase. But perhaps if they read more carefully, if they stopped fighting the river and instead learned how to ride its current, perhaps the future could be endured, if not changed. And that, she realized, was all any of them could hope for. By the second week of November, Black Mirror had surrendered to winter's grip. The trees stood skeletal along the horizon, and ice rimmed the edges of windows like lace woven by ghosts. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the sound of chopping became a daily rhythm. But inside the Caldwell house, thoughts were fixed not on warmth, but on what was still to come. The vision of the flying machine, the crash, the bell tower, the snow, remained carved in William's mind like a mark that would not fade. Though he had seen dozens of fates in his short life, this one felt different, bigger, weightier, as if it were not just a warning, but a test. "I think it's soon," he said one evening as the family gathered in the drawing room. "It feels closer now, like it's already begun, even though it hasn't happened yet." Elias, seated near the hearth, leaned forward. "What else do you see?" William frowned, closing his eyes briefly. "The snow is deep, and the trees are bare. There's a shadow, tall, thin. I think it's a man. But I don't know if he's the one flying the machine or the one watching it fall." The room fell silent. "We've been focused on the machine," Thomas said slowly, "but not the man. What if the vision isn't about the crash at all, but the person in it?" Elizabeth, curled in an armchair, spoke without lifting her eyes from her stitching. "Or someone who causes it." That possibility hung in the air like frost on a pane, delicate, chilling, waiting to shatter. A few days later, the town's rhythm shifted. On the morning of November 18th, a stranger arrived by train. He was a tall man in his 50s, lean with a scholarly bearing, spectacles perched on a nose sun-touched despite the season. He wore a thick wool coat and carried a trunk nearly as large as he was, along with several oilcloth-wrapped bundles. He checked into the Blackmere Hotel under the name Professor Ambrose Whitby of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His stated purpose, according to the innkeeper, was atmospheric research, though he asked more about the terrain than the weather. The moment Elizabeth heard his name, she felt something shift in her chest. She'd seen him at the post office that morning, overheard him asking the clerk about hills and old structures near the forest. She had noticed the ink stains on his fingers, the diagrams peeking from the edge of his papers. "I think he's the one," she said over dinner, voice barely above a whisper. "Did he say anything about machines?" Elias asked, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "Not directly," Elizabeth replied, "but he asked about the old mission, specifically the bell tower. He seemed interested." William, silent until then, looked up from his plate. "It's him." That night, Elias sat alone in his study, pipe clenched between his teeth, staring at the dark window. Outside, the moon lit the frost in pale silver. If it was a man from the vision, if this stranger from Boston truly was the one William had seen plummeting from the sky, then the event was no longer abstract. It was imminent and personal. The next morning, Elias paid the professor a visit under the guise of town hospitality. He found Whitby arranging sketches in his room, delicate technical drawings of something that looked like a massive insect with wings of canvas and wood, an ornithopter. Whitby was polite and intelligent, and, to Elias's surprise, genuine. He admitted to being fascinated by the Wright brothers, and claimed his design would mark a next step in flight. "I chose Blackmere," he said, "for its relative privacy. Less scrutiny, fewer distractions. And that old bell tower in the woods, perfect for visual bearings. Why fly on Christmas Eve?" Elias asked. Whitby smiled. "The air's denser in winter. Ideal for testing lift. And frankly, it's poetic." Elias left the hotel with a heavy heart. He reported everything to the family that night. William listened with growing unease. "He's not just going to fly it," he said. "Something's going to happen. Something wrong. We'll stop him," Margaret said firmly. "We'll tell him the truth if we must." "Will he believe us?" Elizabeth asked. Agatha, who had been silent until now, looked up from her chair. "Perhaps it's time we find out." They debated for hours. The family's secret had never been told to an outsider without consequence. But this was different. This was the first time someone new had entered a vision before the event. Thomas, with his calm demeanor and Harvard training, was elected to speak to him, not as a bearer of prophecy, but as a fellow man of reason. And still, beneath every word spoken, every plan drawn, there pulsed a single truth. The bell would ring, the machine would fall, and William would watch, helpless as always, from the riverbank of time. The air over Blackmere had taken on a brittle sharpness by the time Thomas Caldwell arranged to meet Professor Ambrose Whitby. Snow had not yet fallen, but the ground had hardened, and each breath carried the promise of a deepening cold. They dined at the town's only fine restaurant, a modest establishment by Boston standards, but refined by Blackmere's quiet expectations. Candles flickered between crystal glasses, and the scent of roast lamb drifted to the air like nostalgia. Thomas arrived with a purpose dressed in civility. His words were chosen carefully. Each one lay like a brick in a path that he hoped might lead the professor toward understanding, or at least caution. "I've read your papers," Thomas said early in the evening. "Your theory of bio-inspired mechanics. It's fascinating." Whitby's eyes lit behind his spectacles. "You flatter me. Few outside of Boston have even heard of them." Thomas smiled politely. "I have a deep interest in systems we can't fully control, like nature or time. There was a pause. Whitby sipped his wine, intrigued. You mean the determinism debate? In part, Thomas replied. But more so, the question of whether fate is fixed or merely perceived that way. The professor nodded slowly. A question as old as thought itself. Thomas leaned in slightly. And if I told you that my family has wrestled with this question for generations, not from philosophy, but from experience. Whitby raised an eyebrow. Go on. And so Thomas did. Over the course of the next hour, he recounted a carefully measured version of the Caldwell legacy, visions of the future, unchangeable outcomes, a family ledger that stretched back to the 1700s. He did not speak of William directly. Not yet, but he painted a picture of a family haunted by knowledge, shaped by failure, and bound by the bitter certainty that some futures arrive regardless of effort. Whitby did not interrupt. He asked few questions. But when Thomas finally paused, the professor set down his fork, eyes narrowed in curiosity, not scorn. You're describing a longitudinal test case, he said at last, a record of predestination, outside theoretical bounds. Thomas allowed himself a breath. And yet, despite everything, we've never prevented a single vision from coming true. Perhaps because you misunderstood them, Whitby said thoughtfully. Interpretation is not always clarity. Thomas nodded, recognizing the echo of William's concern. What if, he said, the error isn't in what we see, but in what we expect? Whitby sat back. You're asking me to believe in precognition, in a structured phenomenon that contradicts physics. I'm asking you, Thomas replied, to consider that perhaps you are already part of it. He let the silence hang there, waiting. Whitby said nothing for a moment, then gestured toward the waiter for another glass of wine. Why me? And with that, Thomas told him of the vision, the man, the flying machine, the crash, the bell tower, the date, Christmas Eve. Whitby paled visibly. His fingers tightened around his glass. No one knew my plans, he said quietly. I haven't written about this trial. I only decided to use the old mission last week. Thomas said nothing. And your brother, Whitby continued, he saw this? Yes, before you arrived. The professor stood slowly, pacing to the window that overlooked the dark street beyond. You realize how this sounds. To someone like me, I do. You want me to cancel the launch? I want you to survive, Thomas said. Change the location. Postpone it. Anything. Whitby turned, the flicker challenged his eye. And if I do, if I fly elsewhere later, and nothing happens, what does that prove? That you were wrong? Or that fate can be changed? Thomas stood too, his voice firm. Every time we try to prevent what we've seen, something adjusts. The shape of the event changes. But the event still occurs. You can't escape the crash. You can only change how it happens. Whitby stared at him. Then let's test it. Thomas froze. What? Let's test your theory, Whitby said. I'll stay away from the mission. Spend the day elsewhere. If something still draws me there, if I'm compelled, then I'll reconsider everything I know. Thomas searched his face, looking for mockery. There was none. You're serious. I am. I'm a man of science, Mr. Caldwell. This is the closest I may ever come to seeing determinism unfold in the real world. And if you die? Whitby smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then perhaps fate deserves a better obituary. They left the restaurant in silence, breath fogging the air as they parted at the corner. Back at Harborview Hill, Thomas relayed the conversation. He agreed, he said. He won't go near the mission, not on Christmas Eve. Elias raised an eyebrow. Do you believe him? I do, Thomas replied. But William doesn't. All eyes turned to the boy, who sat on the stairs, his small hands gripping the railing like it was the only stable thing in his world. He'll be there, William said softly. The crash will happen. I saw it. No one questioned him, because no Caldwell ever had. By the time the winter solstice arrived, Blackmere had become a portrait in frost. The sea, steel gray and slow, churned beneath leaden skies. Snow began falling in earnest, thick and silent, muffling the town's every sound. Streets emptied earlier, lights burned longer, and the townsfolk, content in their winter routines, prepared for Christmas with song and pageantry. But the Caldwell house remained a vessel of stillness, heavy with the weight of foresight. Preparations for the holiday moved forward, but there was no joy. The garland above the hearth drooped like morning crepe. The Advent wreath remained unlit. William had changed again. He no longer slept through the night. The dreams, the visions, came in fragments now, fleeting but sharper, images flashing behind his eyes like a lantern flickering through a turning wheel. On the morning of December 22nd, he sat in the breakfast room, untouched food before him, eyes bloodshot and distant. "I saw him again," he said. "Professor Whitby." The room quieted immediately. "He's running through the snow toward the old church." He's scared, looking over his shoulder like someone's chasing him. Margaret dropped her teacup. The porcelain didn't shatter. It only cracked, spiderwebbing beneath her fingers. "Was he flying?" Thomas asked gently. William shook his head. "No, the machine's already there. It's in the tower. He's trying to move it. That's when it falls. That's when the bell rings." Elias stood from the table, walking to the window. Snow fell in silence outside, cloaking the hills in white. "This changes things," he said. Agatha, ever still, only nodded. "There's a second actor now. The vision is evolving." Thomas leaned forward. If someone's chasing him, it could mean sabotage. Sabotage could explain the crash, not failure, not fate. "Someone means him harm," Margaret said, her voice thin. "And we're wasting time with caution. We'll protect him," Elias decided. "The crash may still happen, but we won't let it claim his life." Within the hour, the Caldwell strategy shifted from prevention to protection. Elias sent word to 3 trusted men from the shipyard, not townsfolk, not gossips, to watch the old mission church discreetly on Christmas Eve. Their orders were simple. If Whitby approached, they would intervene and bring him back to town immediately. Thomas, meanwhile, visited the hotel daily under the pretense of friendly curiosity. He spoke with the professor about flight theory, about Boston, about artificial lift, anything to keep him distracted and grounded. But William grew more restless. He sat by the window most days, watching the road below, waiting for something none of them could yet name. "It won't matter," he told Margaret one night. "The river bends where it wants." "You said someone else was there," she pressed. "Could you see them?" "No," William whispered, "but I felt them, like a shadow in the snow." Christmas Eve dawned gray and still. The snowfall had ceased, but the ground was deep with white. Church bells rang in the morning air. Children pulled sleds down the hill near the harbor. But within the Caldwell house, time moved differently. Thick, anxious, slow. Then came the knock. The butler answered. 2 men entered, Chief Warren and Sergeant Miller, the former hat in hand, the latter scanning the room with quiet calculation. "Mr. Caldwell," the chief said, "we're here about Professor Whitby." Everyone stiffened. "He's gone," Warren continued. "Left the hotel early this morning. Didn't say where. Left everything behind. Coat, gloves, even his notebook." Whitby looked at William. "Your visions show you what must happen. Fixed points in time. But they don't show you why or how or what follows. That's where you still have power." Elizabeth, standing by the window, turned slowly. "You're saying we can't stop the future, but we can understand it better?" "Exactly," Whitby said. "Think of your visions like seeing a snapshot, a single image from a film reel. You know the moment, but not the movement before or after. Your error has always been assuming too much about what you see." Agatha's eyes gleamed with hard-earned insight. "The river, as I always said. You can see the bend, but not the current." Whitby nodded. "Yes, but if you study the current, you may be able to navigate the waters more safely." He turned back to William. "You didn't save me from the crash, young man, but because of your warning, others were watching. I was found. I lived. The bell rang, yes, But your family wasn't paralyzed by it. You prepared for it. William looked down. Then why do I still feel like I failed? Because you carry more than a gift, Whitby said gently. You carry expectation. And that is far heavier. The family sat in reflective silence. Finally, Elias rose and walked to the fire, staring into the embers. For so long, we thought the only purpose of this ability was to prevent tragedy. And when we failed, it hollowed us out. But if preparation is the real gift, it changes everything, Thomas finished. It gives us agency, if not control. Whitby opened his notebook, filled with sketches and notes from a lifetime of study. I propose an experiment, he said. The next time William or any of you has a vision, record it, but not just the event. Document every possible interpretation, what it could mean, what factors might influence it. Prepare for multiple outcomes surrounding a single point. Elias raised an eyebrow. And what would that prove? That context matters, Whitby said firmly. And maybe, just maybe, some of those contexts can be shaped. Agatha smiled. You would have made a fine Caldwell. Whitby chuckled, wincing as his ribs twinged. A terrifying compliment. They spent the rest of the afternoon in quiet discussion, not of ghosts or omens or dread, but of observation, structure, possibility. For the first time in generations, the Caldwells weren't planning around disaster. They were planning within it. William, seated in the corner with a mug of warm milk, said little, but as the grown-ups spoke around him, he began to understand something new. He would always see what was coming. But now, he could help decide what came after. As the final days of 1899 slipped into folds of history, Blackmere prepared to welcome a new century. The streets echoed with carolers and the clink of shop bells. Children marveled at electric lights strung in shop windows, a promise of modernity. Yet, within the walls of the Caldwell house, the past remained very much alive. The ledger sat open on Elias's desk. Its pages, centuries deep, told the story of a family that had watched the world move in predetermined arcs, powerless to stop it. But now, there were new notations, margins filled not with despair, but interpretation, context, possibility. Professor Whitby remained in Blackmere through the turn of the year, though he would eventually return to Boston and his lectures at MIT. His days in the Caldwell home left an indelible mark on both sides of the family divide. Science and sight finally sitting at the same table. On New Year's Eve, William had another vision. It came just before dawn as snow tapped gently against his window. The ice house, behind the brewery on Mason Street, a place where blocks of frozen river water were stored year-round, collapsed inward. He saw the timber snap like bones, ice-crushing beams, with bursting outward in a slow, terrifying implosion. But this time, they didn't rush to stop it. They didn't warn the ice housekeeper with vague urgency. They didn't shout about doom. Instead, they applied Whitby's methodology. They examined. They asked questions. Was there new weight added to the roof? Were the internal supports compromised by moisture or rot? Could rodents have chewed the bracing cords? They gathered facts, not fears. And when Elias called for a safety inspection, citing the upcoming delivery of a new shipment of ice, the owner agreed, if reluctantly. The result was telling. The structure was overfull, its supports already beginning to bow under the strain. Elias arranged for a partial dismantling, supervised by the town's carpenters. When the collapse came, as William had foreseen, it happened under controlled conditions. No workers were present. No one was hurt. The ice was salvaged. The business survived. The ledger recorded it with a new kind of note. Vision fulfilled. Context clarified. Damage minimized. Purpose redefined. For the first time, the entry was about failure. It was about adaptation. That winter, something unspoken shifted in the town of Blackmere. The Caldwells, once whispered about with caution or suspicion, became something else entirely. They were no longer seen as bearers of ill omen, but as quiet sentinels, people who seemed to arrive precisely when needed, who had advice at just the right moment, who knew where to find a missing child, the failing beam, the storm-bent tree before it fell. Their secret remained just that, secret, but its weight grew lighter because they had changed the meaning of the ledger. Of the sight, they had not beaten fate, but they had found a way to stand within it. As spring thawed the edges of the town, and carriages once again rolled freely through Blackmer streets, Whitby departed. He left behind no trace of his presence beyond a few letters exchanged with Thomas, a folded glider diagram given to William, and a single quote scrawled on the inside cover of the ledger, his parting gift. Fate may determine the river's course, but human ingenuity decides how we navigate its waters. Years passed. The 20th century arrived with all its electric promise, and the world beyond Blackmere changed. But the Caldwells endured. William grew older, taller, quieter. The visions never left him, but neither did the hope born from Whitby's lesson. By the time he took over stewardship of the ledger, its tone had transformed. Where once the pages were etched in helplessness, they now bore the marks of purpose. The entries still described what could not be avoided, but they also recorded what could be influenced. Comfort given, help offered, lives not spared but supported. And in Blackmere, people came to say something strange when the Caldwells passed through a crowd or stood silently on the edge of a gathering. They always seemed to know. And they did, because while they could not stop the future, they could meet it prepared. And that, in the end, was its own kind of salvation.